Hi, this is Mike Fauché. I've had a couple people request some additional information on, your basic first configuration of the firewall, Sophos Firewall. I have done a couple of other videos on kind of setting it up from scratch, but we'll walk through basically from a fresh installation, the very first screens that you walk to, and then trying to better understand the very first firewall rule, because I think that's really the key. I've done additional videos on web filtering and other parts of the program. This will just cover really the basics and kind of getting it started the first time. So I hope it's worthwhile for you. Anyway, please don't forget to subscribe. Set your notifications, because I do a variety of videos on a variety of different topics, and hopefully you'll find this one worthwhile. So let's go ahead and get started. This video is going to start with the assumption that you've already downloaded the ISO, you've installed it successfully on the hardware, and you're now ready to fire it up for the first time and kind of walk through the initial configuration. So after you've done the installation, after you've installed the ISO and you've got your firewall kind of set up, at least in the initial configurations, the very first thing you do is you're going to attach to it with a computer and basically run the configuration the first time. So the standard web address is 172.16.16.16:4444. That's, of course, with the HTTPS in front of it. That is the default for accessing the administration screen and the configuration screen that you'll see for the first time. So let's go ahead and do that. You'll get the welcome to Sophos Firewall message. Click to begin, and here's the first thing they're going to ask you to do is change the admin password. So you're going to want to do that. I always deselect to install the latest firmware until it's configured, because I don't want to go through that whole thing. So we'll hit continue. And here they show you kind of your configuration. But at this point, what I typically do is to say continue offline. And the reason I do that is because I want to, a lot of times I'm configuring these without anything attached to it, such as a cable modem or anything like that. So we'll go ahead and click continue offline. It's giving you the warning sign that things may not work. Here you're going to give a firewall name, just whatever you want it to be. And of course we're going to pick the time zone. I happen to be in Los Angeles, so not Europe, so we'll go ahead and change that too. Hit continue. It's going to give us a quick overview of kind of the configuration. Again, I opt out of the customer experience, but that's up to you. And then here is where it's going to basically ask you to configure the LAN. So just as a note, Sophos by default sets port 1 to the LAN configuration. It sets a default address, which you can of course change, and by default it enables DHCP. 99% of the time that's going to work for you, so you're just going to leave it alone. You're going to hit continue, and here you're going to enable the options, and of course you're going to enable most of everything. Sandstorm, which is the fourth option there, is not going to work unless you're paying for a subscription. So I'm just not going to even bother checking it off. And here's where you're going to put the email, both the recipient and the sender, which for this example I'll use the same, but in some cases, or your particular case, it might be something different altogether. You can also opt at this point to set the default for sending weekly backup configurations, which I typically do. small little file that gets emailed to you that has all your settings. And here again, it gives you a summary of everything you've just done. So it's to kind of give you an overview of all the configurations that have been completed. And now it's going to finish up the initial configuration. And then when it's done, it's going to reboot. Okay, and once it's rebooted, you're back to the login screen. And you're going to type in the username, which is admin, and the password that you just created when you did your initial configuration. We're going to go ahead and hit log on. Now this screen you'll see until you get it registered. So what I would do is pick I don't want to register now and move on. Again, that same warning. And you're going to see this every time you log into the console until you get it registered. So we're now back into, or we're into the main screen where it's giving you the kind of the dashboard and giving you a view of everything that's going on. Okay, so the thing that we're going to want to look at here, and again, we won't get into all of this because in terms of actual, a variety of firewall rules and filtering and everything else, I have a separate video too, and I'll link to that in the notes so that you can, once you're comfortable with this particular portion, the next logical phase is to set up port forwarding and if you need it, and of course the filtering and web rules, and that's really where the power of Sophos lies, is in the ability to filter. So from here, let's take a quick look at the firewall. So if you've answered the questions correctly, the first thing you're going to see is basically it's created a few default firewalls for you. Now, the version that you're looking at here is the most current. It's the latest maintenance patch that they've released, so your screen may or may not be a little different depending on when you're listening to this. But the thing I want to draw attention to is really the default rule. Now, without creating any rules, Sophos won't let you connect. It won't let you go anywhere. So it needs to have sort of permission to allow the traffic to go out. And that's where this default firewall rule comes in. And it's created for you by default, but if for some reason yours doesn't work or you don't have one, I'm going to show you the elements of creating one. Now, going forward, this really has to be the bottom rule. So, because things are authorized and authenticated from the top down. So, the default rule should be the very last rule in your firewall, so that it's the last thing to allow, because you're basically going to use that as your full access firewall rule. Now, some people used it to block everything. I use it to allow everything and then control the filtering on some of the above rules. So let's keep it simple and let's just go take a look at the default rule. So the first box that you see, of course, is the rule name. Won't spend a lot of time on that. You don't really need a description, and you don't really have a rule group for now. The one thing I do want to draw your attention to is this section here where it says, in this default rule, what is the default action? Is it to accept, to drop, or to reject? And in this particular case, it's accept. So, as it always is from Sophos, is that there's different segments of the rule. So there's a source and there's a destination, and you need to understand what those are. So the source is, where are things coming from? So the very first thing that we want to make sure is that the LAN, which we, again, if you recall to the earlier part of the video, we configured the DHCP for port 1 as our LAN port. So it's using the name rather than a bunch of IP addresses. So it's saying that anything coming from the LAN on any network or source, and you'll see how that's used in some of my other videos that talk more about filtering, because you can control things down to a specific computer or a specific group of computers. By default, any will work. No particular schedule. And the next phase is destination. So where are you allowing it to go to? Where are you allowing the LAN to actually go to? So the obvious choice is the WAN. We want to get out to the wide area network to connect to the internet and see what's out there. So by default, the destination will be WAN. Again, this is in this particular default configuration, which applies to probably 90% of the use case. And again, since we're not controlling anything right now, we're just basically allowing everything. We're going to leave the destination works as the destination network as any, and the services as any. The next step we want to go take a look at. I scrolled a little too far here. There's an option to actually put this rule and match it to a particular user. And again, in the home configuration, most people are not going to do that. So I typically do not activate match known users, because this particular rule is kind of a global rule. Even in your own particular situation, there are other ways to control your network, specifically through an IP address of a computer rather than a user, because you may or may not create users, and it's not necessary that you create users. You can have everybody be in the default group in your home, and that's fine. But you still may want to implement later on some specific controls, and you can do that through a user or through an IP address and a particular firewall rule that attacks that particular system or group of systems. And again, that's more in the web filtering video that I'll link to. The other thing, what you can also do, by default, scanning HTTP is on, the rest are off. It's up to you how you configure it. I scrolled a little too far here. The next section I want to talk to, for the most part, will stay the same. By default, it creates a LAN to general intrusion prevention, no traffic shaping, and web policy is the default policy. And I'll show you what these are, but those are mostly, again, in the second video for web filtering, which I highly recommend you watch. Especially after understanding this initial part, you'll want to take a look at how you can expand the use of the firewall rather than just a basic firewall. And we have, by default, no application control, which again is also covered in the second video. The rest of these you're just going to leave alone. There's typically no reason to change them. This whole synchronized security in the center only works if you've got a business account where you've actually licensed the end user protection in the firewall, so it can all be synchronized and controlled by one particular front end. Very powerful, but also extremely expensive for typical home use. Purpose of this video, this is all we need to do at this point. You can also choose to enable log traffic. That's totally up to you. It works great. The only caveat I'll tell you is that it does use up storage. It does use up CPU power. So if you're limited, if you're putting this on extremely low-end hardware, you might want to leave it off for now, since it is a global rule, and save the logging for specific firewall rules that you're more concerned about. That's my suggestion, but I'll leave that up to you. Okay, once you're done, you're obviously going to hit save down here, and that will bring you back to your main screen. Now at this point, assuming you have a cable modem or some other device plugged in that will take you to the internet, you should be up and running. You should be at least able to send and receive traffic to the internet. It certainly, again, it won't be optimized, but you should be. It should be working at this point. Again, I'll refer you to the web filtering video, because I think that provides a lot of insight as to how you can configure this to really control your house and who has access to what. Very powerful, and not I wouldn't say it's super user friendly, but it's extremely powerful once you figure it out. Okay, a couple other things you might want to know about the basics. Since intrusion prevention, web applications are all covered in a separate video, I'm not going to go into that. What I do want to just show you real quick is the network. So again, these are your ports that you set up based on your physical ports. I do want to bring you caution to one thing here, because it's happened to me and it kind of got me confused a little bit. The Sophos, when you have, it requires a minimum of 2 NIC cards. So you can have either your built-in NIC and an external, or an external, or not external, but like a PCI card with a single port, or you can have a dual or a quad NIC, depending on how you have it configured. The one caution I will give you is that it's not always easy to tell which one is port 1 and which one is port 2. The reason I say that is because Sophos by default uses the lowest MAC address as port 1, and then followed sequentially by port 2, 3, 4, and however many ports you have. So you need to look and see if you're not getting any kind of connection, you're not getting any DHCP. After you've configured it, make sure that you know that you try the different ports. Again, depending on how many ports you have. Optionally, you can disable your internal card and just use a dual NIC, and that will be chronological from top to bottom. So, because that's the way they manufacturer builds it, and that's the MAC address sequence. So that said, as I mentioned, port 1 is actually always by default your LAN. So if I look at port 1, I'm going to see that it's my LAN. It's identified as LAN. It's the port itself is a static port, meaning the actual port, physical port that I'm connected to is a static port, because that's how Sophos gets its connection to the administration screen. So it's a little confusing, but this port, basically you're assigning that physical NIC that says that when I type in this address, this 172.16.16.16, that I'm going to get to that physical NIC and I'm going to actually access the admin screen. The DHCP, which is over here, is a little different. So if I look at the default DHCP server, let's go ahead and open that up. You'll see that it uses that interface. So I'm using port 1 as the interface. And then I've set up a range of addresses here for the DHCP. And you can make this whatever you want. In my opinion, you might want to change this to, for example, maybe 100. And the reason I say that is because you might need to assign some static addresses, which is done right here. And you can build a whole list of static addresses when you, if you want to identify and control a specific computer or device. So leave yourself some room. You don't want to use up, all your addresses on DHCP. So you can take it from either side, either increase this side, which this basically gives me from 17 to 99 to assign as static IPs, and then giving me 154 IP addresses to control on the DHCP side. It's up to you how you configure it. This is just how I usually do it. I usually like to leave myself 50 to 80 IP addresses that I can use for static IPs. Not that I have that many static IPs, but I like things grouped. So I might use, like a .20, 21, 22, 23 for like NAS units, and use .30, 31, 32, 33 for something else. So that's just how I like to do it, but it's totally up to you how you do it. So scrolling down a little further, this one's important, and again, this should be on by default. As you're using this interface, IP, using the interface IP as the gateway, which is your 172.16.16.16. If you've ever configured anything on a network, a lot of times, or manually, it'll ask you for the DNS and gateway. This is where this address is important, and you always, at least for the basic configuration, typically want to use interface IP as a gateway. I'd leave these rest of these lease times and stuff alone. I would enable conflict detection, which it should be on by default, and the DNS settings, again, it's going to use the gateway by default. I wouldn't change it unless you have a particular need to use, Google or some other open DNS or anything like that. And that's where you can, set this up here. I typically pull my DNS settings from my cable modem. Again, you can change it to be what you want to be. And that's about it for networking. The rest of this, you're not going to probably want to do much with. So I wouldn't go making any additional changes right now. I would run the device as it is. And again, when you get ready for, more advanced filtering and applications, I would look into the second video. So I hope that clarifies some of the mystery behind it. It may seem intimidating at first, but if you spend a little bit of time with it, you'll find that it's really not that bad. And once you understand their, I'll say, slightly bizarre logic, it does make sense. And as you see in some of the later videos, you'll see things like how you can name a computer, how you can assign it a static IP address, and how you can make that computer kind of do what you want and be controlled how you want. Again, extremely useful in controlling various aspects of your house, especially if you have kids or, possibly inexperienced users that can go to places on the internet you don't want them to go. So again, this was just to get you started, get you that first rule, try to get a better understanding for the configuration, and then from there, you're going to go on to the next level. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Please, again, don't forget to subscribe and click the notifications so you'll be notified when new videos come out. I'll post also in the show notes some, basic hardware configurations. So if you're, in the market to actually put a system together, you can take a look at some recommendations here. But if the best thing is obviously to repurpose something that you have sitting at home, because that's one of the beauties of Sophos, is that it'll pretty much work on any Intel-based hardware. So if you got an old Core i3 or something that's semi-power efficient, that would be an ideal firewall. Don't underestimate that it takes some power and memory. You want to have at least 4 to 6 gigs of memory. The free configuration does limit you to 6 gigs of memory, so even if you put 8 or more, it's not going to read it. But the other thing I would recommend is whatever hardware you're using is pop the installation on an SSD. It's really worthwhile. So anyway, again, I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. We'll see you on the next video.